Hello and welcome or welcome back to the channel. My name is Judy and I love travel, history, and finding out how people live and what makes them tick. We have been visiting Barcelona, a gorgeous city located on Spain's Balearic coast. Like all successful cities, it has changed over time. The most recent revival is probably the beauty treatment large parts of the city received in anticipation of the 1992 Olympic Games. However, the previous revival, in which the city was finally permitted to demolish the Roman era walls and expand outside the perimeter of the original Roman city, was equally, if not more, impressive. The Barcelonans call this new area Eixample, which is a Catalan word that means expansion. Today we're going to visit Barcelona's first suburb, meet two design geniuses, and see what they left behind for us to gawk at, with me, the armchair traveler, as your guide. Casa Mila, which is sometimes nicknamed La Pedrera, which means something like stone quarry. It's as different from Casa Batlló as it could be. This time, unlike that building, Gaudi was able to design from the ground up. In 1905, a man named Park Guell and his wife, Rosario, commissioned Gaudi to design the building. Their requirements were for owner apartments and many other rentals to carry the cost of construction and operating the building into the future. Construction began in 1906 and ran on until 1912. Gaudi was given full creative control over the project, allowing him to design the building according to his vision of natural forms and modernist principles. In this case, he designed something visually striking, but far more spare than Casa Batlló for the owners. He abandoned, for the most part, the brightly colored tiles and stained glass visible from the street over there. What you see here is a modern view of Antoni Gaudi by a man named Josep Subirachs, which is at La Sagrada, final stop on this walking tour. I think this portrait expresses his firmness of purpose, something that would become increasingly obvious in coming years as he gradually abandoned everything except his beloved temple. On the right is a photographic image of his patron, Park Guell, taken at about the time the building was being constructed. As you can see, the facade here is very different from the faces of the surrounding buildings. The most striking feature of Casa Mila is its undulating facade. Instead of a traditional load-bearing wall, the facade is a kind of a curtain wall. It's a thin, non-structural wall that wraps around the building and is home for a lot of decorations. It was beautiful, and it also let in plenty of daylight. Each level was decorated with balconies, 32 in total, which showcase intricate wrought iron grills. Gaudi ingeniously recycled used scrap iron sheets, bars, and chains to create these expressive and decorative elements, and turned the work over, as usual, to local craftsmen. They are considered the forerunners of abstract sculpture in the 20th century. This view of the detail of the facade gives you an idea of the complexity of the work. Now, about the entrance doors. Gaudi was all about practicality and aesthetics. Since large sheets of plate glass weren't readily available in his day, he ingeniously assembled irregularly shaped panes, inspired perhaps by animals and plants. The result was a door that could swing open in the middle for vehicles and to the sides for pedestrians. It's like Gaudi said, let's have an opening and an event with these doors. Once inside, you encounter an interior courtyard with a highly decorated air shaft designed to provide light, ventilation, and access. Anyone who's ever lived in a multi-story apartment building looking out on an airwell knows that they generally aren't designed to be pleasant and really often don't do that great a job of providing ventilation. Casa Mila was quite different. The airwell was meant to connect the apartments and comes complete with steps, plants, and other decorative elements. Walk upstairs to the roof and you'll find the highly decorated chimneys necessary for the heating and ventilation system, but also a view in the general direction of Gaudi's Basilica, La Sagrada Familia. The view was probably an accident, but I suspect the increasingly religious Gaudi was quite pleased with it. When you enter those doors from the street level, you arrive in a large courtyard. These steps lead up to the family apartment complex. The airwell is actually partially frescoed. Once upstairs, you see how the hallways connecting the apartments follow the shape of the facade, leading us along these curving pathways. The apartments were quite nice. This is a laundry room included in one of the individual apartments. While much plainer than the areas where the renters lived, it does show a window and a nicely tiled floor. Likewise, the kitchen and servants' dining area, while it might look pretty primitive to a 21st century American, included decoratively tiled floors and walls. Through the door, you can see the much finer flooring intended for the owner's area. All that cooking ended up in the owner's dining room, shown here. Notice the floors, the chandeliers, the inlaid parquet flooring, covered partially with a rug, and the plaster decorations built into the walls themselves. Our next stop is Gaudi's magnificent unfinished temple, La Sagrada Familia. It's the largest unfinished Catholic church in the world so far, now scheduled for completion sometime in 2026, the 100th anniversary of the designer's death. The story here begins in 1882, when a new, more or less neo-Gothic Catholic church was imagined and planned. The design was assigned to an architect named Francesco de Paula del Villar. Del Villar apparently got into what could typically be called technical disagreements with the funders. The best guess is these were over costs of the materials. He wasn't exactly fired, but he did depart, leaving room for Antoni Gaudi to be hired as his replacement. Gaudi, as you'll guess from the taste of the two previous buildings we visited, had other ideas, completely different ideas, and a store of new and potentially cost-saving building techniques that got him the job. Like his Gothic architectural forebears from the Middle Ages, he made drawings and even models, and then he told the builders and the craftsmen what he wanted done. He watched over them, but he let them have at it. And like every major church I've visited, as you'll see in a moment, it was built in stages. Underneath the apse is the crypt of the basilica. This is a sacred place dedicated to Saint Joseph, as construction actually began on his feast day. It's also where Gaudi himself rests. Imagine the echoes of his creativity resonating through those stone walls, whispering to the masons and the stone carvers and the architects and the artists what he really wanted done. He trusted and relied on those workers, but he also supervised them. Joseph, the father of Jesus, was a carpenter. It's fitting that this crypt honors the patron saint of workers and craftsmen. Churches often have more than one facade. Like the relatively new facade attached to Barcelona Cathedral, the main entrance is designed to really catch your attention and knock your eyes out. Gaudi, who never did anything by half measure, decided to go further and designed 3 facades for his basilica. The oldest, shown here, is the Nativity facade. From a distance, despite the towers, it doesn't look terribly appealing, at least not to me. The guide told me that it's generally described as looking something like a decorated wedding cake with the frosting sliding down in globs. Up close is a very different story. The facade celebrates Jesus' birth and tells a story of his childhood. When you zoom in on the details, you can see something like this, a very realistic portrayal of a recently delivered Mary cradling a barely visible infant, again seated on a donkey, just like she had been on Christmas Eve, and accompanied by a much older husband. Like the details in a medieval Gothic cathedral, these were startling in their beauty. Even so, ask yourself what kind of desperation would cause a husband and a newly delivered wife and infant to flee in the middle of the night on a donkey? The New Testament tells us that an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream and told him that Herod was going to murder the child. The angel, who is unnamed, told him to take Mary and Jesus to Egypt for safety. Perhaps the figure we see on the left, shown leading the donkey, is that unnamed angel. I suspect hardly anyone would notice these details unless they were pointed out to them, or like me, they had a pretty good camera and were able to zoom in. The Passion shown here is spare almost to the point of plain and coldness. It tells us the story of Jesus' suffering and death. Work began on this part in 1956, guided by some of Gaudi's original surviving drawings, but the details were actually sculpted by a man named Josef Maria Subarac. His style was more modern and groundbreaking compared with the older styles, but it fit right in apparently with Gaudi's vision for the facade. Gaudi wanted the exact opposite of happy, joyful, and hopeful, and I'd say they succeeded. Looking upward from the piazza in front, you can see a carefully guarded Jesus. The helmeted figures are clearly meant to represent soldiers, trudging uphill, carrying his cross, and then on the next level up, Jesus on the cross. The skull visible at the base of the cross tells us that Jesus was not the first man to meet this fate on this site. Medieval architects and artists sometimes tried to insert their own images in their work as a way of signing them and making sure that later on someone would remember who created the piece. Gaudi was no different. In the statue on the right, we see Jesus tied to a column. The face is that of the architect himself. Facing south, and in the general direction of the sea, is the glory facade, which, once it's eventually finished, will become the main entrance to the basilica. This photo is dated from 2019 and shows the unfinished work. It comes from Wikipedia and is far better than my own attempt at photographing the same site at the same time. At that point in the construction, the facade clearly had a long way to go. You can clearly make out the rusting rebar in the columns in front, and the rest of it is actually kind of boring. Like the rest of the basilica, eventually every architectural or decorative element will have a symbolic meaning, most of which fly way over the head of your guide, who was raised in the Protestant tradition. Those columns you see in front, the ones with the rusting rebar, represent the 8 Beatitudes, the lessons taught by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Although Gaudi did not live to see this completed, he did have a plan. This model, now in the Basilica Museum, gives you some idea of the intent of the design. The entrance is covered over with lanterns in 2 layers. The bottom layer features 7 lanterns and is supposed to represent the 7 days of creation. The upper layer, with 9 lanterns, symbolizes the 9 choirs of angels, praising God. Here I admit I am in way over my head, but I do know that angels have ranks and include the highest, a seraphim, presumably in the center. This bronze casting gives you a better idea of the final intent. The plain glass you see in the middle now will eventually be filled in with stained glass. I'm looking forward to returning to see this once it's complete. Once inside, you might think your weary eyeballs would get a rest, but you need to keep them open. When you walk inside, you feel almost like you're walking into a kind of a forest. There are 36 supporting columns, each looking more than a bit like a tree trunk. Light comes in through stained glass windows, the reds and blues are especially bright, and are designed and placed to provide a different look to the inside of the basilica depending on which windows are illuminated by the sun. There are surprises inside as well, like this statue representing St. George. Remember those Roman soldiers, the ones we saw hustling Jesus up to his crucifixion? This soldier, there's no dragon, looks a great deal like them, and that wasn't by accident. George himself, according to the stories, was a Roman soldier who refused to recant his Christianity during the time of Emperor Diocletian and was murdered for it. George is the patron saint of Catalonia. This figure was only added in 2007, the 500th anniversary of George's proclamation as the patron saint of the Catalans. Park Guell is a garden complex with some architectural elements located outside the city limits of Barcelona. It's about 48 acres and seems much larger when you walk it. I think this is the largest park in the city, and much of it to this day is wood and parkland. Unlike Central Park in New York or the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris, it initially was designed as a housing development. Eusebio Guell, whom we met earlier, purchased a rural estate outside the city on what was then called Carmel Hill and planned to build a garden city there, where his friends and well-off families could enjoy the greenery and views. He hired Antoni Gaudi to design. Gaudi did so in his modernismo style, emphasizing organic forms, decorative motifs, and the general celebration of nature. The development was meant to provide somewhat whimsical living spaces. You can see some of the decorative elements in this photograph, but included benches, winding paths, a kind of Greek theater, and a covered public square called the hypostyle hall. The hall was intended to serve as a marketplace. The development was never completed. Probably the biggest problem was that while Eusebio could provide a lovely setting and hired Gaudi to design something really dazzling, the area lacked public transportation. It would have been a huge problem commuting to and from the area and the downtown, where most of the residents would have had their businesses and the ladies would have done their shopping and socializing. The park was also designed with what I think of as considerable snob appeal. And it did appeal to the wealthy, but was far less attractive to everybody else. By 1914, only 2 of the planned 60 homes had actually been built, and the development was abandoned. One of those homes actually became Gaudi's residence for the next 20 years or so. He lived there with his aging father, who died fairly soon after he moved in, and a niece, but after the niece passed away, even Gaudi abandoned the area. Public transportation between downtown and the park does exist, but I think the wiser choice is to spend some money on a taxi and save a lot of time and quite a bit of walking. I learned this one the hard way. However you visit, this area deserves time and attention, and probably a great deal more than I was able to give it. There's a lot to see here. The first thing that strikes you is this entryway. It's a mosaic. Inside, you'll find another mosaic, this time of what I imagine was meant to be a dragon. I thought this might have something to do with the ever-present St. George, the patron saint of the city, but this is actually quite different. The dragon was meant to represent a mythical guardian of the entire garden. Notice that the dragon is covered with bits of mosaic tiles. Whether it's a dragon or, as some people claim, a salamander, this isn't the only wildlife specimen to be found in the park. Up a fairly intimidating set of steps, you'll find the pavilion. Underneath is a porch or portico, which was meant to be a covered public meeting space and a market area. It's now somewhat neglected and is shown here from below the entryway. Inside are massive columns and a great deal in the way of decorations. Much care went into this design. The area is open but shaded and would have actually been a good spot for vendors, perhaps selling fresh produce. Going above the marketplace requires still more steps, and to be honest, I wonder how carefully, or if at all, Eusebio and Gaudi thought this one through. Perhaps all of their clientele were able-bodied, but much of this area would be accessible only to people who could walk. At the top is a completely unshaded pavilion, complete with benches tiled with more bits of broken mosaics, now somewhat neglected and in need of restoration. Those benches are quite welcome, as is the gorgeous view, at least on a clear day, of the city and La Sagrada Familia in the distance. The park, you'll recall, sits on a substantial hill, and that area had to be shored up. Gaudi disguised this construction as a covered walkway. You can see that it stretches around much of the northern end of the park. You can walk on top in the sun, or more interestingly, at least in my opinion, underneath. Walking underneath reminds me of photos I've seen of athletes surfing an enormous wave. The area gets its name, the portico of the washerwoman, because of the image of a washerwoman incorporated into one of these columns. There are no water taps or laundry tubs here. Those would have been in the individual home. Thank you for joining me on this tour of 4 Gaudi masterpieces. When I was preparing my script, my husband asked me which one of these I liked the best, and my honest answer is, I don't know. I think there's so much to see that I probably missed 100 details, and probably more, than I caught. I look forward to returning to Barcelona, perhaps in time to celebrate the completion of Gaudi's Basilica. Come back next time for another adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide.